Levi Brackman here with Truth's Jewish Wisdom for today. Thank you so much for joining again. Before I begin, if you like this podcast, please subscribe, like it, leave a review wherever you listen to the podcast, whether it's on Spotify, whether it's on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, so other people can find it as well. Now that I've got that out of the way, let's jump right into this episode about postmodernism and Judaism. In the past episodes, I've spoken about what postmodernism is, where it came from, the effect that it has on society, on the culture, and also on Judaism. As promised, today I'm going to talk about an alternative to that postmodern approach and why actually the Enlightenment and the values of the Enlightenment in science are still so important and relevant. And in my view, actually, those values are inherently Jewish. Now, a lot of Jews have taken or tried to take a step back from those values, but I believe that Judaism is an ancient religion and it's not what you want it to be, it's what it is. Now, you might not like what it is, but that doesn't mean you can start to transmogrify it and change it into whatever you like it to be. That's not what it is. It actually has contours and it has boundaries of what it is and what it isn't. Well, we can disagree on where those boundaries are, but we can't just make it into whatever we like. So I want to talk about what I think is the quintessential Jewish approach, and then I'll try and bring proofs to it and how we should see the world around us, especially reality as it exists. Postmodernism has a relativistic approach to things, in which it says, I have an experience of something to be true as it is, because empirical truth is not something which we can reach, because there's nothing which we can actually see objectively, and we can't therefore have objective view on reality. All we see really is our subjective nature, and therefore no two people see it exactly the same way, and therefore none of us have access to actual reality, and therefore everything's relative to each other. That's very high level, more or less, what postmodernism is. As opposed to that, you find those who see science as being able to say, yes, we do know the truth, we can access the truth, and you can't just have this subjectivity. Not everything goes just because you feel it that way. So really the approach is somewhere in the middle, not totally subjective and not totally objective. Rather, the approach is somewhere in the middle. And I'm going to start off with an observation, which I have observed, but other people have also observed this, and that is that the Torah doesn't really talk about truth as this empirical fact. It talks about chesed emet, which means kindness and truth. And although emet is used, the word truth is used in other ways as well, but the idea of truth is generally used in this qualitative sense and equated to kindness. It's more of a moral truth than of an empirical truth. Abraham says to his servant Eliezer, do chesed ve'emes with me, do kindness and truth. In other words, do something kind and something solid for me, rather than saying do something which is absolutely true, empirically true. So the Torah doesn't really make a claim to empirical truth, and that kind of makes sense because empirical truth was not something which people really spoke about then. That wasn't really the way people viewed the world. So there was always like this qualitative aspect to truth. That said, there was something else, which was this idea of judgment. And you find this week's Torah portion, the whole idea of all these laws refer to how do we judge something. When something occurs and there is a dispute, who's right and who's wrong, who gets to pay damages and who doesn't have to pay damages, what is the punishment that they receive, what do they owe, who is it owed to, how much is paid, etc. All those things are judgments. Someone has to make a judgment and decide, based on the preponderance of the evidence, what is the law. And then you have a framework and a guidelines of what the law is, and then based on the preponderance of the evidence and based on the judgment of the judges, the law is applied, and then people have to carry out whatever the judgments are. So this idea of a judgment is really, really important. And the idea that people can make a judgment, which then should be respected, is, I would argue, a cornerstone foundation of Judaism. It's actually, if you look right after, even before the Torah was actually given, we find that Moses is standing there judging the people. People came to him and they had disputes, and he would judge the people. Jethro, or Yisroi, who is Moses' father-in-law, came along and he saw this and he said, well, one second, you can't just be one person judging the whole time. You need the ability for other people to also judge so that you can delegate some of your responsibilities to other people. So it's not just you, Moses, doing everything and judging everything, but you can also have judges and different levels of judges who can also help you out in judging the people. But this idea of having judges and court cases and courthouses is a fundamental principle within Judaism. As a matter of fact, one of the 7 Noahide laws, in other words, one of the laws in which the Torah says is not just applicable to Jewish people, but is applicable universally, is this idea of having courthouses and places where you'll have a judge, and the judge can look at the evidence and decide who's right and who's wrong and how the law applies. So judgment is important and absolutely vital for any kind of society to exist in a way in which is civilized. You need the ability to make judgments, and judgments in a way in which people can agree on what's right and what's wrong. It's fundamental. It's a fundamental concept within Judaism. So we have 2 things to summarize. First of all, there is no such thing as empirical truth within the Bible. It doesn't seem to exist there. Truth is equated with kindness, so it's do me a solid. It's more of a qualitative nature, not empirical nature. It's more of a moral kind of truth. Do something really solid for me. Do something kind and solid for me. And then, but you do have, instead of truth, you have this idea of judgments that we should be able to turn to courthouses, to Batei Dinim, to a Beth Din, turn to judges, and judges should be able to weigh up the evidence and come to some kind of conclusion. And then you have a judgment. And then you have another thing, which is tzedek, which is righteousness. And tzedek tirdoif, it says, and you should chase and run after tzedek of righteousness. Righteousness is also not truth. What is righteousness? That which is correct. It doesn't say truth. It says that which is correct. And the judges are the ones who judge fairly and in a righteous manner. And you should run after this ability to judge in a fair, righteous way. So you have judgment, and you have righteousness, and you have kindness, but not empirical truth. Why shouldn't we be searching for empirical truth? Because we can't find the absolute truth. The absolute empirical truth is not something which humans can actually have access to. And interestingly, Maimonides brings this up. You would think Maimonides, the arch rationalist, he was a person who relied on the scientific mind, at least of the time, for all kinds of things. He was a doctor. And in the very beginning of the Guide to the Perplexed, he asks the following question. He says, if we see the story of Adam and Eve, Adam sinned. He ate from the tree that he was commanded not to eat from. And then all of a sudden he found that he had this newfound knowledge to be able to distinguish between good and bad. So Maimonides asked the obvious question. 1 second. Before he sinned, he didn't have this knowledge. Now he does have this knowledge. So he gets rewarded for the sin with newfound knowledge. Why is it that Adam would be rewarded for sinning? Why is he rewarded with gaining newfound knowledge of the difference between good and bad after having sinned? And the answer Maimonides says is that actually he wasn't rewarded. He was actually taken down a peg of his knowledge. Prior to that, according to Maimonides, Adam had the ability to discern truth and falsehoods. He was able to intuitively know what was empirically true and what wasn't empirically true. After, however, you had him sinning and eating from the tree, now he lost his ability to discern absolute truth, empirical truth, and instead he was left with a more moral kind of truth to know the difference between good and bad. Inferred from this is the idea that humans don't have the capacity to actually discern empirical truth. It doesn't exist. So you might say, well, that's postmodernism. Everything's relative because no one has the ability to have the truth, and therefore it's all our truths, and therefore if it's all our truths, then everything's relative. And there is something correct about that in certain aspects. But the problem with that is that then all truths and all people's belief systems and the things they assert are put on an equal footing. And that is incorrect. It contravenes the idea of mishpat and tzedek, of judgment and righteousness. Because that idea that we can't ascertain and reach absolute empirical truth does not necessarily therefore imply that everything else is equal and that there is no such thing as truth, and therefore anything anybody asserts could be equally true. We do have an obligation to weigh up the evidence and come to a considered judgment. I'm going to throw one more aspect into this, and that is the idea of falsehoods. So the Torah does say, mitva sheket tirchak, you should keep far from falsehoods. It doesn't say don't talk falsehoods. It doesn't say only talk the truth. Rather, it says mitva sheket tirchak, which means you should stay far from falsehoods. Now, some people argue and say there's this idea of putting gates around an avera, putting gates around a sin, that the sin itself is bad, and in order not to get even close to the sin, you should put a gate around it, and therefore you should make sure you're far away from the sin. And then they point out that the only sin which has built into it a gate in the Bible itself is falsehoods. So not only falsehoods should you not follow and say and be involved with, but you're obligated to keep far away from it. That's how bad falsehoods are, according to that understanding. That might be correct. But I prefer an alternative or different interpretation of it. And that is that it's on a spectrum. You have, on the one hand, you have absolute falsehoods. On the other hand, you have absolute truth. It's a spectrum. Something which is totally false and something which is 100% empirically true. Now, where do you fall in that spectrum? Knowing that you can't get to absolute empirical truth, what you can do, though, is keep far away from the absolute falsehood. So it's a spectrum. Absolute truth, you're never going to get all the way to the absolute truth. Absolutely false, well, you might get to absolute falsehoods. You could get there. But the obligation is to keep further away from here. Get further along the spectrum towards truth, so that you're as far from falsehoods as possible. You'll never get to absolute truth. You'll never get to the true empirical truth. But keep as far away from the absolute false as possible. And how do you do that? Through mishpat, through judgments, and through pursuing tzedek, through pursuing righteousness, that which is right, not that which is false. So by learning and studying and analyzing and conducting science, you can maybe not get to the absolute truth, but you'll keep far away from falsehoods. And that's the obligation. Now, if we go the postmodern route, then you wouldn't have to say keep far away from falsehoods, because who's to say it's false? Just because you think it's false, that doesn't mean it's false. Well, the answer is there is such an ability that humans have to keep far away from falsehoods by analyzing, by doing science, by studying, by listening to the evidence, by weighing it up. We have the ability as humans to get far away from what is false. Might not get to the absolute truth, but we can pursue righteousness. We can tzedek tirdef by weighing up the evidence and by judging things correctly based on the evidence that exists. Now, this is similar to what science does. This is just a really interesting place where Judaism, our religion, dovetails with science. There are some people who argue, well, science and religion are two completely different things. Well, they are in some ways, and I agree with the approach of the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who I knew personally. I agree with his approach where he says you have religion and then you have science, and they're actually two different genres and they're doing two different things. One's telling you how to live your life and the other one's telling you how things exist in the world. But they are actually compatible in this sense. How does science work? Well, you have what's called null hypothesis testing. And what does that do? Well, anytime you do a scientific experiment, you're trying to prove one scenario over the other scenario. So what you have, to use the jargon, is the null hypothesis. That is the status quo, if you like. And what you're trying to find out is whether the evidence supports the null hypothesis or the alternative hypothesis. So let's say you have a medication and you're trying to show whether this medication actually has an impact on curing a disease. So the null hypothesis is that actually this medication does nothing. It's exactly the same as a placebo. That's the null hypothesis. Now what you're trying to bring evidence for is the alternate hypothesis that actually this medication has an impact on the illness or on the disease more than a placebo has. So what you do is you have the trial, and you'll have a double-blind trial to make sure that it's a valid trial, so the outcome is correct. And by the way, the double-blind trial, which means that neither the doctor or the people who are running the experiment know who gets the placebo and who gets the treatment, and the people who are getting it don't know either. And that takes away a lot of the bias out of it. And they're randomly assigned to each group as well. So there is no way in which you can have one group of patients which are more likely to respond positively to the treatment in one group because they're randomly assigned to both groups. And there are other ways of taking out bias. There's blocking and other kinds of ways of taking out bias to make sure. So you have a double-blind experiment, you have random assignment, you have blocking, and all other kinds of ways in which you can make sure that you're taking bias out of the experiment. But what it's trying to do is it's trying to say that the alternate hypothesis is more likely the outcome than the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis would say nothing happened here. The treatment is exactly the same as the placebo. The alternate hypothesis says that no, the treatment actually has an effect on the disease in curing it in some kind of way. Now, the interesting thing here is that usually the cutoff is something called 0.05. And what that means is that you would say, if you perform this experiment 100 times, then you would say that less than 5 times out of 100 would you find that there is no difference between the placebo and the treatment, which means that 95 times out of 100 you will find an effect of the treatment. And that is good enough to say that there was an effect. So what you would say is that the effect was greater than 0.05 and therefore, or less than 0.05, depending on which tail you're looking at the test. And therefore you would say there was a significant effect here, and therefore we're going to reject the null and accept the alternative hypothesis. We're going to reject the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis says there's no difference between the placebo and the treatment does have an effect, therefore. So we're going to reject the null, and we're going to accept alternative hypothesis. If, however, it is greater than 0.05, which means that in more than 5 times out of 100, you don't see an effect, then we do not reject the alternative hypothesis, and we therefore stay with the status quo, and we say the null, we just keep the null there and say there is no difference. So in other words, science never tells you that the fact is the treatment has an effect. That's a fact. It never says that. It doesn't say 100% empirical fact, the treatment's always there. It just gives you the probabilities of the treatment having an effect, and therefore if the probabilities that the treatment has effect is high enough, and it's a pretty high standard, then we accept that the treatment has an effect. It doesn't mean that treatment has effect all times. It doesn't mean it has it every time it's given. It doesn't mean that it's even perfect. It just says that we're able to accept alternative hypothesis based on the probabilities, and we reject the null hypothesis. That's all it says. So science never actually tells you 100% about anything. It's always in probabilities. So that said, the idea is not to get to the absolute empirical fact of the truth 100%. Science never does that. Science is just trying to get you closer to the way things really are, rather than stating facts. This is the way it is 100%. It's just trying to get you further away from falsehoods. So we saw an effect greater than 0.05, then the falsehood would say that there was no effect. That would be false. There was an effect. Does the treatment work 100% all the time, every time? Does it totally cure? Science would never say that. Science would just say the probabilities of it occurring based on what we've observed. And it never gets to 100%. It always gets very close, perhaps, to 100%. Close enough for us to be able to almost with certainty, at least for us as humans, reject the null. But it never says that the null is the truth and the alternative is false, or the alternative is the truth and the null is false. It never says that. All it says is that we can reject the null and accept the alternative hypothesis based on the probabilities that we see. This is a really important thing to understand about science, because a lot of people portray science as an arbiter of the truth. and of empirical fact 100%, and it doesn't. It never does. That's a misunderstanding of what science does. What science is trying to do is midvar sheket tirchak. It understands that we're trying to give you probabilities to be able to navigate. So if the null can be rejected, then we can reject it and we can give a number on how far we are away from the null. Again, you have the null hypothesis as being correct here, and you have alternative hypothesis. So are we able to say, if we say that the null is correct, right, then that the probability that's not true, because we have a 0.5 effect. So that means we can reject this and we can get away from that because that's closer to false. Okay, so the false would say if there was a statistically significant effect, then we would say that accepting the null would be closer to falsehoods because there's an effect, and therefore we reject the null. Therefore we're staying far from falsehoods, but that doesn't mean that the effect is 100% and it's certain and it's empirically true 100% all the way. So it's midvar sheket tirchak, in my view, is very similar to the idea of the null hypothesis testing. You look around, you look at the evidence, and then you're able to make a judgment based on the preponderance of the evidence, and then you go and you run tzedek tirda. If you run after righteousness, again, you're not saying you have to be 100% righteous. You're saying running towards righteousness, away from sheker, away from falsehoods. And what's the mechanism through which you can do that? That's through judgment. And you find this all throughout Judaism. So here's another example. We have the 10 Commandments. And the first of the 10 Commandments is, I am the Lord your God that took you out of the land of Egypt. And there is a discussion whether this is a commandment or whether this is just the fundamental principle upon which everything else is based, and it's not a commandment. So is there a commandment to believe in God? Or is this just a statement of principle that I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt? And there are quite a few of the commentators who believe that this is just a fundamental statement of principle. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, and this is the way it is. But then the next question is, if God is going to introduce himself in the 10 Commandments to the Israelites, then shouldn't he say, I am the Lord your God who created heaven and earth? I am the Lord your God who created heaven and earth. That would make much more sense, and that's actually a much bigger thing. Rather than the parochial God that took the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, this is the global God, the universal God that created heaven and earth. Why doesn't it say that? And one of the answers is because the Israelites never saw the creation of heaven and earth. They would have to take that on faith. That would have to be an axiom. Instead, God wanted to tell them, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. And you saw that. There was evidence that I took you out of Egypt. You just came out of Egypt. I split the sea. I inflicted the 10 plagues upon the Egyptians. That was me. I am that Lord. So you need evidence that I exist. Well, you have the evidence. I've shown you the evidence that I exist. Now, here are the rest of the commandments. So even God, when introducing himself to the Israelites, and when he was telling them, you should keep my commandments, he felt the need to bring evidence for it. So the Bible is not telling you this is something which you experience, and therefore it's your experience, and that's your truth. Rather, the Torah is trying to talk to a truth that has the preponderance of evidence that supports it. That doesn't mean that it's 100% truth, because the fact is that there's room there for people to disbelieve and to come with a different explanation. But what this is saying is that God had to work hard by bringing evidence and proving his capabilities, proving his loyalty and fealty to the Israelites, and proving his existence in many ways. And then once he's done that through the 10 plagues, through taking the Israelites out of Egypt, through splitting the sea, bringing them to the desert, providing them the manna, etc., then he can descend upon Mount Sinai and say, Anochi Hashem Elokech, I am the Lord your God. And the evidence that I am the Lord your God, the evidence that I exist, is because of all these things that I've done. And now you can think about it, and you can bring through the preponderance of the evidence, you can judge that this is actually a fundamental principle based upon which the next things that I'm going to say in the following commandments and the following mitzvot that I give exist. So there's a need for some kind of evidence. don't just accept it on belief alone, and it's also not asked that it should just be an experiential thing, but rather something outside of the self has to be provided for the evidence of the existence of God. But it actually goes further than that. Because if you actually study the Ten Commandments and the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, what you find is that, at least according to Nachmanides, the great medieval commentator and Kabbalist, he says that this was actually a guided prophecy on behalf of all the Israelites. What does that mean? It means that all the Israelites at that time experienced prophecy, and Moses guided them through that prophetic experience. That's what happened on Mount Sinai. Now, what was the point of all of that? There are actually some people who would argue that that means it was deeply personal experience. It was a subjective experience, not an objective experience. That, I think, is the wrong interpretation to take from it for two reasons. First of all, because you see that I took you out of the land of Egypt. There is a reference to something outside of the Israelites that occurred to bring the proof of God's existence. And then that guided prophetic experience, that, according to Nachmanides, was to bring proof to Moses being the greatest prophet. Okay, because you might say, well, God took the Israelites out of Egypt, and that proves something about God. But how do I know that Moses is actually talking to God? Well, are you going to take that just on faith? And the answer is no, they're not going to take it just on faith. Moses and God, through the giving of the Torah, took the Israelites up to the level of themselves being prophets, so that they now could look and view Moses' prophecy and see that is a prophecy where God is talking face to face to Moses. They understood their level of prophecy, and then they were able to then see and discern that Moses had a qualitatively greater level of prophecy than they had, and therefore now they had evidence that Moses was a greater prophet, and therefore they should trust Moses. So again, you see the need, in a sense, for there to be evidence brought in order for the Israelites to be able to believe. Don't just believe blindly, but we have evidence for that belief. And this is the concept you find in Judaism in many different places, that it's not just blind faith, but there's evidence brought to the faith so that people could make a judgment and say that there is some external evidence which informs my opinion and informs my belief. Not just an internal experience that I have, not that I have personal conviction, but there's some kind of thing which is going on outside me as well, which I've seen, which I bring into the judgment, and through the preponderance of the evidence, I make that claim and have that belief. So of course, people can look at evidence and come to different conclusions. But if your desire is to look at the evidence and then keep away from falsehoods and get closer to tzedek, closer to, so you are midvasheket tirchak, you're keeping away from falsehoods, and you're tzedek tirdef, and you're running towards righteousness, running towards that which seems to be more correct and righteous, then at that point, that's all you're asked to do. So you're weighing up the evidence, and the Israelites on Mount Sinai had two pieces of evidence to weigh. Number one, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. Okay, there was this great power which took us out of Egypt. And then they were taken on this journey of prophecy, where they were able to discern Moses as being a greater prophet. That's another piece of evidence that Moses is a real prophet. And those two pieces of evidence together allow them to make a judgment, and upon that, the entire Judaism is based. Now the question is, what happens in the next generation, the generation afterwards, etc.? Fine, that's different questions. But there is a fundamental idea and principle here, which is that this wasn't just an internal thing that they were asked because I experienced it and have experiential Judaism, therefore I understand and know it. But rather, it's a concept of a judgment that you're asked to make based on real evidence that is presented and offered to you. Now, that doesn't mean that people can come along and say, I am in charge of all the truth. Right? This is called Truths, my podcast, Jewish Wisdom for Today, because it acknowledges that religion provides not the truth, but truths. Is the same thing as what I'm saying. Because the further you get away from falsehoods, the closer you get to tzedek, the closer you get to truisms and truths, rather than the truth. Because the truth, as I've mentioned, that is inaccessible. But you're asked to make a judgment whether this is one of the truths or not, or whether it's one of the falsehoods. That you're asked to make a judgment about. And to make a proper judgment of that, you have to be able to weigh the evidence, and not just the evidence that exists inside you, because that's totally subjective, but to look at evidence which is also outside you. Now, to deal with what Kant spoke about, and which he said that basically it's impossible to actually get to any real subjective truth, and that might be true. I don't disagree with that. But just because you can't get to true subjective truth doesn't mean that some things aren't more tzedek, more right than others. Some things are more. Some things are closer to falsehoods than others. And that is the way it is. For example, in science, you have this thing called inter-rater reliability. So, for example, part of my background in psychology is psychometric testing. So we did a lot of psychometric testing when I was in university and through my PhD. And part of psychometric testing is that you ask people questions and they answer the questions, usually on a scale of 1 to 10 or true or false, but with a few in between. Very true, somewhat true, true, extremely true, or something like that. And then you take that and you put it through a psychometric analysis to figure out what the underlying structure of the construct that you're trying to get at is, etc. So without getting into the details there, the reality is that every single person who answers a question is answering it based on their own subjective views. So what you do is you take not just one person, but you have a sample of many people, because one sample size is extremely biased. And then you do a psychometric analysis and you try and figure out, well, what is in common between all these people, so there's something which you can actually get at, which they all share, so you now get to something which is real. Another way of doing it is in qualitative analysis. You might have different people which are rating a certain sentence structure or certain text, and then you look at the different people who rate it, what they all have a view of, and therefore you can see what's in common, so you're getting at something underlying, a construct that really exists there. In other words, there are ways in which science can actually remove away some of that subjectivity to get to something which is more objective. So in other words, the more you're able to peel away the subjectivity, you get more to the objectivity, the closer you're getting away from the falsehoods, and the closer you're getting to the tzedek, I'm not going to call it the truth, but to the righteousness, to that which is correct or more correct. And it's a spectrum. So you're going to work hard to get there. It reminds me, when I was a teacher, I used to tell my students that they'll learn so much that they'll get to the degree where they don't know. They'll feel they really don't know. When you're young, you think you know everything. And then you get older, you learn more and more and more, and you realize I actually don't know that much. So the student said to me, well, if I'm anyway going to get to the place where I know nothing, so why should I even start? And my answer to them was that the recognition of knowing nothing when you've studied so much is so much deeper than the recognition when you haven't studied anything. They're not the same thing. Once you've studied a lot, you understand your limitations of your knowledge. Whereas when you've studied nothing, you don't know the limitations of your knowledge at all. You just have nothing. You have no knowledge. And the point is that, yes, we're never going to get to truth, but there is degrees of it, how far we are from falsehoods. And that is a fundamental idea in Judaism. And that is also a fundamental idea in science. This is where science and Judaism dovetail together. Science never says that I'm going to tell you the ultimate empirical truth, which is the absolute truth of everything. It's always in probabilities. Judaism never asks you to get to the absolute truth either. All it asks you to do is keep away from falsehoods. And that's fundamentally important. And if you're postmodern, you're not keeping away from falsehoods. You're actually equating tzedek, something which is closer to being right. The tirdoif, that's the idea of running after tzedek. You might never get to tzedek completely, but you're running after it. And you're keeping away from falsehoods. That's what you're asked to do. If everything's equal, you are just equating false with tzedek. And that we're told not to do. Science and Judaism both say the exact same thing in this regard. So to try and say that somehow Judaism can fit in with postmodernism, I argue that Judaism is fundamentally opposed to postmodernism. Judaism has quintessentially the ideas of science, at least the values of science. It's not a counter-enlightenment religion. It's an enlightenment religion. It is a religion which says that keep away from falsehoods, try and do what you can to make judgments in order to find the truth, and do that through evidence. In the ancient times, that was evidence of taking the Israelites out of Egypt. God took them out of Egypt. It was Moses bringing them evidence of the kind of prophet he was, and then them allowing them to make the judgment so they believe in him. But the idea here is that not everything's subjective. There is some evidence, and you are called to make a judgment, and you're called to keep away from the falsehoods and put a flag in the ground and saying, this is what I believe based on the evidence and based on my judgment, because I am tzedek tirdof, I am chasing righteousness. The other thing about here is that we are called to actually stand by our values. We are called not to just say, well, I am being tolerant of everyone else, I'm respecting everyone else's opinions and their right to be correct the same as I have the right to be correct. That's not what we're called to do. We are called to judge, study the evidence, and then make a decision and stand by our values. It's very difficult to stand by our values if we think everything's subjective, because why are my values any better than someone else's values? You have to have the conviction to stand by your values. And there's a process to gain that conviction. And that process is through judgment based on the evidence. And by believing and knowing that by looking at the evidence, you can get closer to tzedek and further away from sheker. Closer to the right path and further away from the false path. And when one does that, then you can stand for your values. These are my considered values. These are my considered beliefs. Why? Because I've put in the effort to get there and there to get these beliefs. Not just because I feel it, but rather because I've actually worked hard, studied, analyzed, and this is where I'm at. And then you can have conviction for it. And it's okay to say this is qualitatively better, and this opinion, these values are better and more correct than other opinions. You put in the work to get there. You should have the conviction to stand by it. Whereas the postmodern approach, you can't really have conviction other than, I feel it, he also feels it, therefore we're the same. No. You're called to actually look at the evidence, make a judgment, and then walk and pursue righteousness. That is the approach of Judaism. And that is very similar to the approach of the Enlightenment. Now, of course, there are aspects and elements of Judaism which seem to be counter-Enlightenment as well. I'm acknowledging that. I'm not going into it right now. But this fundamental idea is so important. It starts off with the Ten Commandments and the idea of judgment. And we're called to make judgments. We're called to have courts of law which judge based on the evidence. It's a universal concept. It's one of the 7 Noahide laws to have courts of law where people are called to make judgments based on the evidence, not just based on feelings. And we are called to keep away from falsehoods and move towards righteousness. This is fundamentally important. And that is done through looking at the evidence. We're called to follow the commandments, and the basis of that is from looking at the evidence and making judgments. It's not this kind of whatever goes, whatever I feel. That's not part of it. So this has been Levi Brackman with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today. In the following episodes, I'm going to have conversations with people. So we'll have a few interviews with different people about postmodernism and Judaism. They'll bring different opinions to it. But this wraps up my monologues on postmodernism. And we'll have some interviews in the next few episodes. And then we'll wrap up this season about postmodernism. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you've gained something out of it too. Thank you so much for being with me. I look forward to next time when we interview Rabbi Levi Morrow. And that will be next episode. But meanwhile, have a wonderful day. And until next time.